Related into a tough week for the Prime Minister Tony Abbott. As well as confronting a Senate poised to block key elements of his first budget, he's also having to deal with a hopping mad Premier in Queensland. Campbell Newman is calling for radical changes to the income tax system to compensate for hefty cuts to funding for health and schools for the states, totalling $80 billion over 10 years. But Mr Newman says he definitely won't be pushing for a higher GST, saying he doesn't support raising taxes. Political correspondent Louise Yaxley reports.
Tony Abbott can't afford to put all his focus on steering the budget through the Senate because the premiers and chief ministers are angry and also need his attention. The state leaders are meeting in Sydney on Sunday, and Queensland's Campbell Newman's issued a rallying cry.
And I make the point that if the states and territories don't hang together on Sunday, they will be hung separately by this federal government.
The emergency talks are sparked by the $80 billion of cuts to schools and hospitals revealed in Tuesday's budget. Mr Newman says he's hopping mad, but he rules out arguing for a higher goods and services tax.
We don't support the GST going up. It's as simple as that, and neither do the other states. Look, enough pressure has been put on families and individuals by the moves in this federal government budget without contemplating more tax increases. There's enough pressure on people's cost of living. That's why I'm not going to play this game. And it's a very cynical game that's being played. I'm not playing it. And most First Ministers that I've spoken to are not prepared to play that game.
Mr Newman's told Radio 4BC his answer is for the Commonwealth to hand over some of the income tax raised in his state to compensate for the cuts.
The fair, reasonable and sensible way to go, if states are going to be allowed to be running these things and taking full responsibility, is that, 10 cents, 15 cents, whatever it needs to be, of the taxes that people are paying today should automatically go to Queensland, New South, etc. And then we can then stand on our own 2 feet and we can sink or swim in terms of our performance.
Mr Abbott's been non-committal.
Well, I'm very happy for Campbell to be thinking of various proposals which Queensland may well bring to the Federation White Paper process. But what I'm on about is lower, simpler, fairer taxes. That's what I'm on about. And I'm on about a federation that works better.
Tony Abbott was with the New South Wales Premier this morning. Yesterday, Mike Baird described the federal cuts as a kick in the guts. Today, he was more measured.
Oh, well, it's a real challenge. The long-term position in relation to finances, particularly in relation to health, is a long-term challenge. But what I had said today is that I'm absolutely heartened by the Prime Minister, who is willing to respond and engage in a constructive discussion on how we fix it. Coming together. You can achieve much more coming together, and I'm very confident that's what will happen.
That row with the states will drag on, as will the negotiations in the Senate over the budget. The Labor leader Bill Shorten's confirmed he'll try to block changes to the pension and the proposed $7 Medicare co-payments.
If Tony Abbott wants to attack universal Medicare for all with a new GP tax, he will have to come through me and the Labor Party. We are determined that Tony Abbott's bleak vision, built upon broken promises and lies before the election, will not create a permanent underclass in this country.
The Health Minister, Peter Dutton, says the government isn't prepared to negotiate on the co-payment.
Well, we're not, and the reason is that we looked at the $15 that was recommended by the Commission of Audit, and we believe that $7 provides a balance.
Last night, Mr Shorten taunted Mr Abbott to call an election if he can't get his budget through. The Prime Minister is trying to tone down talk of a double dissolution.
Look, we're going to get on with governing. We're going to get on with governing, and we are confident that one way or another we will be able to negotiate the various budget measures through the Senate and into practice. That's what good governments do.
That's the Prime Minister Tony Abbott ending that report from Louise Yaxley. Well, as we've heard, health is firming as a clear battle line in the Senate, and the lobby group representing the nation's doctors says the federal health minister's claim that doctors will profit from the $7 co-payment proposed in this week's budget is not true. Health Minister Peter Dutton says government modelling shows GPs will reap a windfall of $468 million over 4 years, which will allow them to continue bulk billing poorer patients. But the Australian Medical Association's federal president, Dr Steve Hambleton, says GPs will be 25% worse off by bulk billing patients under the co-payment scheme. Speaking to me from Toronto earlier, Dr Hambleton said there will be other costs to be borne by doctors as well.
Currently, if GPs are bulk billing, it's very simple. There's very little staff required. It's a simple signature on a piece of paper, or it's a key transaction with a computer. If there's a mandatory payment for everyone, then there'll be requirements for banking, for change, for a float in the morning, for probably a new staff member to basically do the banking. And if you add up, it's probably one staff member for 4 GPs will probably cost about the same as the co-payment.
So how do you think Peter Dutton reaches the conclusion that the co-payment will not only cover the shortfall in visits but deliver doctors a profit?
Look, I think it's looking at the simple figures, and of course you just need to be on the front line of care to understand that that's not how it's going to be. I mean, assuming you get the $7 up front every time, the doctor may be $2 better off if they were bulk billing everybody. So I guess the thing to say is, look, we're not against the principles that the minister's trying to promote. I mean, the minister's saying, well, if people can afford to contribute to their care, then that they should. And I think the AMA would say, well, we don't have a problem with that. But the minister also says they should make a contribution where they can afford to do so. And I think that implies that he understands that there are some patients who can't afford to do so. And that's the concern the AMA's got. And we do want to work with government to say, well, what are the policy goals here? We know from our exposure to our members that there are individuals that really will struggle and will defer care. And I guess we've named them before. It's Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Australians who already we have a gap we want to close. The very low income earners who if they've got a couple of sick kids and they've got to get a prescription for both and maybe even a pathology test, we could be talking about 5 co-payments or 4 or 5 co-payments on one day. One each for pathology, a couple of payments for prescriptions and maybe a couple of payments for the doctor. That may just be a discretionary payment, like is it the dinner we buy tonight or do we go to the doctor? And we don't want to put Australians in that position.
Peter Dutton also says that this is designed to break the bulk billing business model that's currently being used by some doctors, where they use it as a tool to lure patients to them when the doctor down the road doesn't bulk bill. Do you agree that that may change that business model?
Well, it certainly would, and I don't have any problem with the Minister's principle that, or the government, the Prime Minister's principle that if people can afford to contribute towards their health care, then they should. The AMA has a view that to provide quality primary care, quality general practice care, which will structurally change the costs in our health system, the GP could spend longer with the patient. We know they'll provide more comprehensive care. We've said that it's people aren't accessing longer consultations because the payment structures are just not working. Now, if they could, and we say that a standard visit for a GP on average should cost about $73, not $36, we would get a better productivity from our GPs from a health perspective, not a throughput perspective. And we think that would benefit the system. So we're not against co-payments. We do have a concern, though, about those low-income earners, and we need to work with government to try and solve that.
So if you believe that doctors won't profit from the co-payment, do you disagree with the Minister's premise that it will help you to continue to bulk bill for the poor and the vulnerable?
Well, no, sadly it won't. If a bulk billing practice moves to a $7 co-payment, there'll be no net benefit. Now, if they choose to bulk bill someone after the July 2015, the rebate will be 25% lower. It'll be the $5 rebate reduction lower, then it'll be the low co-payment incentive lower, so probably $11 or $12 lower than now, which is about a 25% reduction. Small businesses are not capable of taking a 25% reduction. There'll be no incentive to direct bill. There's got to be a better solution.
So what is that solution? Has the government reached out to you at all in devising this budget plan to try and maintain the safety net for the disadvantaged?
Well, I think that's the key. I think the Minister has suggested he's already going to reach out to the senators who have to try and get this through. We'd also like to have the Minister reach out to the AMA and work with us to say, well, what are you trying to deliver? Is there a way we can sort this to deliver what the government needs and still maintain that access? Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Australians are a good example. We're trying to close the gap. We know that there are in rural areas where there are very low incomes, large families and a high burden of disease, that community-controlled health centres have a real problem raising any funds and raising any co-payments from their clients, from their patients. We need to think about that because we do need to close that gap.
But this is the other side of the argument, isn't it? Peter Dutton says Australians are currently funding 263 million free medical services each year, including 70% of them from non-concessional patients. That's not sustainable, is it, given that the population is ageing, medical technology is advancing and will be costly down the track? Do you accept that premise?
Well, not quite. I mean, it's interesting that 70% of the bulk billing is for non-concession card holders. I mean, that's perhaps where the government should be focusing its attention. Is it sustainable? Answer yes. Because we are actually about, we're just below the average for the OECD for our spend of total healthcare in this country. So we're doing a pretty good job. Our chronic disease management in this country, for diabetes, for example, number one in the OECD. We are 1/7, not half, but 1/7 of the admissions to hospital on out-of-control diabetics. It's a pretty amazing statistic, so we're doing a good job. Yes, costs are growing, not in primary care, however. They're growing down the track in hospital care. So we do need to make sure our primary care structures are set up to actually manage chronic disease, keep people out of hospitals. And this is the reform agenda that we've got to continue.
That's the Australian Medical Association's Federal President, Dr. Steve Hambleton. In his budget in reply speech last night, Opposition Leader Bill Shorten continued to challenge the premise of the government's tough love budget, arguing there's still no case to claim there is a fiscal emergency. Joe Hockey has used a speech in Melbourne this morning to accuse Bill Shorten of ignoring the economic mess left by Labor. But economists who've now had a chance to thoroughly sort through the budget's projections say there are still few signs that Australia's on the verge of a fiscal crisis. Business reporter Pat McGrath.
At a Liberal Party fundraiser breakfast in Melbourne this morning, Joe Hockey offered something of a philosophical grounding for his first budget. The bigger the government, the smaller the people. The smaller the government, the bigger the people. And that's what we've done. Bill Shorten's budget reply speech last night took a different perspective.
The beginning of extreme policies with an extreme impact on the Australian people. The budget papers reveal the economic truth. Australia is fundamentally strong, and so is the legacy that Labor left behind.
Joe Hockey fired back today. What we inherited was a mess, and if you believe the Leader of the Opposition last night, he's standing over the twisted metal of a train crash and he's saying there's no problem here, move on. And so questions remain. Is there a budget emergency? Perhaps the best people to ask are economists like the University of Canberra's Phil Lewis.
I think emergency is probably too strong a word. What we have is, although our debt and our deficit is fairly low by OECD standards, what various reports have shown, and is now indisputable, is the structural deficit is a problem.
So that structural deficit, that's the debt that we're carrying through these different cycles?
Yes. You see, we expect when the economy is going through a recession, for instance, essentially there'll be a budget deficit because there'll be increased unemployment payments, less taxes collected, etc. When the economy is doing really well, we expect there to be a budget surplus, and on average, we have the structural deficit, which should be about zero.
Bringing down that structural deficit can occur through longer-term cuts to spending and through pulling in more revenue through taxes and charges.
My feeling is that at this stage, the government is going to address expenditure cuts, and then in the next series of budgets, or possibly after the next election, they're going to address the taxation question, probably through an increase in the GST. But I think their major concern in this round has just been with expenditure cuts. I think that's probably wrong. That a deficit can be solved either by reducing expenditure or increasing revenue, and probably a bit of both.
There have, of course, been measures to increase revenue, the Medicare co-payment, the twice-yearly indexation of the fuel excise, and the deficit levy on high-income earners. This morning, Tony Abbott said they all fit in with his government's approach to fiscal policy.
That governments, no different from families and businesses, have to live within their means.
But Bank of America Merrill Lynch chief economist Saul Eslake says comparing governments to households and businesses isn't entirely fair.
Because governments, like some businesses, exist forever, and it's not as if there is, within reasonable limits, a point at which governments must pay back all their debts in the way that households, who don't last forever, at some point in their lives have to do. On the other hand, clearly governments can't go on running deficits endlessly and building up the sort of debts that we've seen built up in the United States, in Japan and in many European countries.
Saul Eslake says to figure out whether the government has been facing a budget crisis, it's worth looking at the scale of our debts and deficits compared to the overall size of Australia's economy, the gross domestic product.
The truth, in my view, is that the budget deficit in prospect for 2014-15, prior to this week, was 2% of GDP, with public debt in the range of 14% of GDP. That's worse than it should have been, and it's worse than the previous government had led on, but it hardly amounted to a crisis or an emergency.
But there are problems further ahead.
The real problem that the government inherited was the sharp increase in the budget deficit and in spending in 2017-18, the year after the forward estimates of the last Labor budget, and correctly in my view, most of the thrust of the measures in the budget are directed at the period 2017-18 and beyond. That's where the problem was.
Bank of America Merrill Lynch chief economist Saul Eslake with our business reporter Pat McGrath. The opposition leader described the federal government's plans to cut income support to young people as the single most heartless measure in the budget. The government wants young job seekers under 30 to wait 6 months for welfare. From then on, they'll have to work for the dole. The proposal looks like having a long journey through the Senate, but one charity the World Today spoke to says it's already bracing for an explosion in those seeking assistance. Wendy Karen reports.
Morning guys, which side for watching?
In inner city Surrey Hills, the street level centre opens for breakfast. The service is run by the Salvation Army for rough sleepers and offers a range of welfare support, including cheap meals.
Only coffee, free and white, thank you.
36-year-old Darren has lived on the street since he was 15 and comes here most days.
Yeah, just about every day. I come here for a shower and everything like that, come back and kick back, relax. I toss and turn a bit because I sleep on the street. So I come here some days and I crash out for a little while.
The Salvation Army's Robin Evans runs the street level centre.
We provide facilities for people who are homeless, such as things like lockers to store their belongings, laundry facilities and showers. And we also provide some other support services like housing support, no-interest loan schemes.
Robin Evans says it's a service in high demand, and she's worried that's going to increase if the federal government's tough new measures for young job seekers go ahead.
That's going to be quite a significant impact on not just the young people, but also agencies like ourselves. The reason I say that is because the day after the budget was announced, people already started ringing us asking if we were going to be increasing the support that we could offer, if people could come more regularly, because of that fear that they weren't going to be able to afford their rent, pay their bills, afford food. And, there are people who are actively pursuing employment but have not been able to receive a job or sustain study due to mental health issues or quite complex social issues. So to take away income from them will increase their dependence on our services.
In his budget reply speech last night, the opposition leader, Bill Shorten, vowed to block the changes to the New Start allowance.
Prime Minister, how will people under 30 looking for work, how are they supposed to survive on absolutely nothing? This Prime Minister's vicious, victim-blaming policy will create a lost generation of Australians shut out of the workforce, and Labor will have no part of it.
The Social Services Minister, Kevin Andrews, says some people will be exempt from the new measures, including single parents, carers and part-time apprentices.
Most importantly, all a young person has to do is to get into the training, and we're providing more assistance for training, and then they'll be exempt from these provisions. So if they're work ready, they don't want to go to training and they don't want to go to work, well then they'll be caught by these provisions, and we think that's fair.
Kevin Robbie is the Executive Director of Social Ventures Australia, which works with employment organisations. He says based on the latest detailed labour force figures, it's getting harder for young people to get work.
Youth unemployment is at 12.5%, which is double the overall unemployment rate. And there are now more than 50,000 people aged between 15 and 24 that have been unemployed for more than 52 weeks. And that's treble what it was back in 2008.
He says there are more innovative ways to tackle youth unemployment.
You know, there's research that's been done worldwide looking at the ways to do this, and it needs, you know, innovative design and course delivery and financing within education to really look at careers for young people. I think that you need to get employers engaged with young people early, and, you know, getting industry involved in schools around that, and then building the right support structures that allow the best interventions to scale up.
Cutting up veggies, getting ready for lunch.
Back at the street level centre, Robin Evans says she'll continue helping her clients until the future of income support is clear.
You know, at the moment, nothing has been said about how agencies like ourselves are to support what will be a big gap in financial aid for groups of people. So the fear is prevalent, and we expect it will grow as we get closer to that start date. But we do fear an increase of pressure on our services as well.
Robin Evans from the Salvation Army speaking with Lindy Kerrin. Aid groups are still digesting the news that Australia's foreign aid budget will be asked to do a big part of the fiscal fix-up. Official development assistance will be capped at $5 billion until 2015-16, when growth will be pegged to the CPI. But $2 billion of funding previously pledged for the 2017-18 financial year will no longer be honoured. Aid groups say this will have a devastating effect on those who need assistance the most. Sarah Sedgie reports.
Actually, I'm going to have a bit of a rant myself before coming to the end of the video. As I understand it, the plan in Joe Hockey's budget is to rip $80 billion out of education and health, public education, public health. They're also ripping another $500 million out of the CSIRO's budget or something. 450 scientists have got to get the axe. The Murray-Darling Basin Water Management Board, all gone. The Land Care Program, axed that. Got rid of anything that had clean energy or green energy in its title. They want to get rid of the renewable energy target, get rid of the Clean Energy Finance Corporation. Want to get rid of things like federally funded legal aid for Aborigines. They got rid of all kinds of early intervention programs to stop troubled teenagers from going to jail and stop people in jail from going back to jail. They got rid of all of that. Their plan is to offer a propaganda fig leaf, a Potemkin village fig leaf, to the scientific community and to the entire public health sector, is to say, oh yes, we're going to cut $12 billion out of hospitals which are delivering currently existing medical research results, right? The results of previously conducted research are now being delivered at the moment by the doctors and the nurses in the hospital systems and the GPs and the clinics and all the rest of it. So they're going to cut $12 billion out of that, and they're going to put that in a medical research future fund together with the $7 per doctor's visit that they're going to charge anybody who goes to visit the doctor. which since Gough Whitlam was elected in 1972, it's been free for Australians to go to the doctor. We've adopted the policy that back in the days of the Eureka Stockade, when the baby died because nobody in the tent had sixpence, that was a horrible system. The idea that people who think they're sick with something serious should fail to go to the doctor because they haven't got the money to pay the doctor's bill, that was considered ridiculous. The idea was that everybody in Australia should be able to go to the doctor and be treated for free by the government, because the government figured it was better to have the entire population healthy and able to work than have pockets of sickness and disease going untreated, where it would linger and spread. That was the whole idea. On the subject of health insurance, I used to work at the Vegetable Creek Hospital at Emmaville, where the first health insurance scheme in Australia started, when the local miners were troubled by not having a doctor, and the Chinese immigrant miners said, oh, well, like back in China, everybody pays the doctor a part of every week's wages, and if you're too sick to work, the doctor has to treat you until you get better again. And in Emmaville, or Vegetable Creek as it was called, back in the 1850s, 1860s, they thought that was a great idea. So all the miners had a little fund, and that paid for the first cottage hospital at Vegetable Creek. Since then, they've got this idea, some doctors, that they can't possibly work for the government because that would be communism. They want to work under a private enterprise scheme where they employ themselves, but they're troubled by the fact that no individual citizen generally can afford their bill. Therefore, they've applied to the health insurance companies which have sprung up to pay their exorbitant bills and fees. And, well, not to put too fine a point on it, a lot of the private medical establishments in Australia are pretty much competing for the length of the shag pile carpet in the corridor, and how good the 3-star, 4-star, 5-star meals are that the hospital cafeteria really shouldn't be delivering to sick people anyway, and carpet's a bloody awful idea in a hospital because it harbours dust and infection. But yeah, a lot of people don't want to go and be treated in a Nightingale ward where they're sitting with 30 other patients in a big open air room where they can see other people who are as sick or sicker than them, and therefore they're not feeling like they're being left out, and thus'n because even the person who gets no visitors gets to see the colour and the pageantry of the visitors going to visit the people who get lots of visitors, and people get better faster in an old-fashioned Nightingale ward. They get better treatment than they do when they're locked up in individual rooms, and if you don't like somebody, you can just ignore their buzzer and leave them and forget them. But anyway, I digress. The whole private medical system is not a good idea, and the suggestion that Australia needs to have its health system fixed by dismantling the public health system so that the money can be put into a medical research future fund, not to spend the $20 billion on delivering healthcare, existing technology with existing money that is currently being used to deliver health. No. Now they want to do blue sky research into the cure for all cancer, something to reverse dementia. So they can say to all the disemployed scientists and all the researchers and all the people who used to be paid to keep the population healthy, oh, you should go and look for a job with the research fund when we get the money in the bank, when we get the interest check, when we get some grants happening. It's fig leaf politics. And why is it so? What for, how come and why? We've heard from the economists that there is no, quote, budget emergency. That's a figment of Joe Hockey's deranged imaginitis. What we've got is a right-wing ideological push. Now, Australia imported a whole new right-wing class of fascist rulers from white South Africa when they let Nelson Mandela out of jail, and he said to all the people who didn't want to live in a free and democratic South Africa, take your money and run, you rich white fascists. And they did. They run to Australia. Johnny Howard said to them, if you've got $1 million, you're called a business migration immigrant. And all the Wenwees, when we were back on the Cape, when we were still in Rhodesia, when we had slaves, when we could keep servants, when we could beat the boys and rape the little girls, the Wenwees came to Australia and built think tanks and right-wing enterprise institutes and took over the economic schools at the university. And the editorial columns of, like, Rupert Murdoch's newspaper that loses millions of dollars a year, but he subsidises it because he likes there being a right-wing voice in Australia. And then we've got Joe Hockey fronting this policy. What's he? What's his cultural background? He's a Lebanese Maronite Christian from New South Wales. So his parents have run away from Lebanon, where there was no pensions and no dole, and the men were shooting at each other on the streets over minor disagreements. And you certainly couldn't go to university for free in Lebanon when Joe Hockey's parents run away to Australia. But in Australia, what's the reputation of Lebanese Maronite Christian politicians, eh? Well, there'd be Richard Torbay. He's a good Lebanese Maronite Christian politician. What do we know him for? Oh, that's right, he was supposed to be an independent politician, but he was actually being bankrolled by Eddie Obeid. Hey, now there's another Lebanese Maronite Christian politician operating out of New South Wales. He's a Labor one in the New South Wales government. Eddie Obeid's a Liberal one for the New South Wales seat, funneling money from the 5x8 Corporation to the Wurrunga Federation to the Free Enterprise Foundation and back to the New South Wales Liberal Party, just like the law says you can't do. And Joe Hockey's got a nostalgic desire, just like the White South Africans have got a nostalgic desire to have armed guards on every street corner, and an indentured labour force of poor people who can't afford to do anything except go where they're told, when they're told, because they're told, and live on the smell of a greasy rag if they're lucky. Joe Hockey's got this nostalgic deep desire to return to the images he imprinted in his earliest childhood, where grown men were shooting at each other on the streets because there was no dole and no pensions either, and nobody could get a university education. That's why his parents came here, because they liked it in Australia the way it used to be, and now Joe Hockey wants to dismantle it in the cause of right-wing ideological, fascist, corrupt, crony-capitalist political ideology. I hope they get Palmerised in the next Senate if they don't throw a temper tantrum and call the double dissolution election that Tony Abbott was threatening yesterday until Bill Shorten called his bluff last night in the budget reply speech. Warbles on a lot to YouTube. Things as crook in Tullarook because the Liberal National Party fascists literally seriously intend for our children, like I have a 24-year-old daughter who's unemployed. Their plan for her is that she has to magically make a job happen where there has been no job, or live out of garbage bins, sleep in the streets, come back and live in my bunk room, I guess, for 6 months and then go and work for the dole. And if you haven't got magically made a job happen by then, go and work for the dole again. There was a general practitioner on Life Matters Radio Talkback this morning. Oh, my back's going bananas. He said he could confidently predict an increase in the rate of youth depression rates, youth psychiatric illness rates, and suicide rates in the under 30-year-olds if the Liberal policy on unemployment benefits is put into practice. He was on radio, and because he was a GP, they'd let him go through without having their finger on the 7-second delay button. They got a bit embarrassed when he said that the government should stop behaving like fucking thugs. That's what a general practitioner said about Hockey's bullshit budget, which is currently hitting Tony Abbott's fucking fan. This video's too long. I hope it'll upload anyway. Warbles on a lot to YouTube. Ciao.